So Bharatwaj and I began to think together after we met in September 2022 at one of Alfred's conferences. And then last January, we did a co-presentation on the things that we're working on and continue to work on. And so, we've been thinking about Heidegger's thinking, the challenges of his thinking, and the unthought in his thinking, as well as, examining the thinking of certain people who work on Heidegger and even venturing outside that realm for people that examine polytheism, devotedness, mysticism, anything related to dwelling or the things we're focused on. There's many places that we could start as a starting point, but we've kind of zeroed in on this notion of the decision in Heidegger, only because the gods, or like Joachim pointed out, maybe that's not the best word, the divine, something like that, only because that brings our existence to language do we enter the realm of the decision concerning whether we will promise ourselves to the gods or deny ourselves to them. So, each of us is indeed deciding one way or another at any given moment, perhaps, and every new day brings us opportunities for decision. We decide what it is to which we will devote ourselves, and we decide to think or not to think, to ponder, to question. We decide if we will seek to dwell. I've personally been observing for some time now, a number of years, that each time I arrive at an understanding of some aspect of Heidegger's thinking, I will linger, tarry, while away for a while there, only to find myself wandering again, looking for traces in his work, and then uncovering some further clarifying insight that then necessitates that I go back and try to begin again, so to speak. And of course, this brings to mind Heidegger's point that we must possess a readiness to let our own attempts at thinking be overturned again and again by what is unthought in the thinker's thought. And so a lot of our energy, Bharatwaj and I, have been devoted to trying to do this to the best of our ability. If dwelling in the fourfold is something that we wish to pursue, or it's something we can try to enact, then we have to make the decision to do that, and that involves deciding to give ourselves over to meditative thinking. Wherever we may be at any given moment, right here, right now, on our own patch of home ground, as Heidegger says. And this can be challenging, and no doubt at present, at least in the US, especially right now, it feels like when there are powerful forces undertaking to limit freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of exploration. If we hope to escape our enframing, we must decisively, as Heidegger tells us, pit meditative thinking against calculative thinking and go beyond tired binaries and dichotomies, one of which would be, what is active and what is passive, subject and object, as Leighton brought up. All of those things limit us and, again, are the result of this ontotheological metaphysics that must be overcome. So it's beyond the active and passive, really, that we can come to understand what it is to be open to releasement, to enter Gelassenheit. For in releasement, there is possibility. It is via such a way of being that we can indeed transform our worlds. And as Iain Thomson has written, we human beings are facets of being, unique and finite perspectives on the historically shifting constellation of intelligibility, a temporally unfolding intelligible order that together we constitute and transform. Releasement arises via this comportment that Heidegger sees as embodied by the poet, the mystic, but it's a comportment that's attainable to anyone, he says, anyone who would seek to emulate it. For, as he says, we are all, each of us, meditative beings. That comportment is characterized in some works as Wissenschaft und Zärtlichkeit. And it's the Zärtlichkeit that I'm interested in, that tenderness or that vulnerability. And that itself is key, I think, to us being able to recognize opportunities for decision and to be willing to make the decision for the divine, if you will, rather than a decision against it. This openness, tenderness, and vulnerability may be seen by some as dangerous, setting them up for risk or failure or harm, while others would characterize it as a disinterested detachment. Neither of those things really capture this kind of vulnerability. Of course, anytime there's vulnerability, there's a potential for harm. That's just being in the world. But any kind of detachment that is reached by the mystic, the poet, the person given to this way of being is not disinterestedness, all right? It's rather the fundamental coming to presence in openness, which means a letting go of certain kinds of judgments, if you will. Heidegger tells us that this vulnerable comportment is indeed what is necessary for dwelling in the fourfold, as it makes possible that meditative thinking that he says can and must direct all of our calculative thinking. Okay, so it's in the building dwelling thinking essay, it's very clear that for him, the meditative thinking is primary, and the meditative thinking must direct the calculative thinking if we are seeking to dwell. For he says, we bring dwelling to the fullness of its essence when we build out of dwelling and think for the sake of dwelling. He tells us also, releasement toward things and openness to the mystery belong together. They grant us the possibility of dwelling in the world in a totally different way. And it is this totally different way or ways that Bharatwaj and I are most keenly interested in trying to, think about, explore, come to some form of meaningful articulation. By letting go of our willing and assuming and owning the inherent partiality of our individual perspectives, we embrace our finitude, we embrace our vulnerability. We open up to what is possible, to mystery itself. And is that point that, arises a possibility for this sort of interruption of the divine into our experience, into our lives. Sometimes the interruption of the divine could be world-shattering, sometimes not. Other times it can be subtle, a shift of mood, a feeling of intimacy. It's myriad ways it can show up in terms of the way we are understanding how it operates in the fourfold. Sometimes, of course, the interruption of the divine births a vision of a new world in and of itself. This makes me think of this quote I've loved for a long time from the Anais Nin. She says, each friend represents a world in us, a world possibly not born until the friend arrives. And it is only by the meeting of this friend that the new world is born. And so while it may not be seen as proper by some to think of the divine as a friend or the gods as friends, I think shifting our understanding to thinking of it in that way is much more in line with what Heidegger has in mind. It's healthier, and it helps us get away from this entrenched ontological metaphysics, where the gods are always understood through this Abrahamic religion schema. And so, encountering a new friend, encountering a spirit in a tree, if you will, what have you, these can be things that occur on our journey, right? And that offer us new ways of being, a new vision, a new way of understanding. It also brings to mind something that it's just because I happen to teach this essay, and William James, right, who's preceding in time Heidegger, and who's an American pragmatist, has this great quote. He says, one who would shut himself up in snarling logicality and try to make the gods extort his recognition willy-nilly or not get it at all, might indeed cut himself off forever from his only opportunity of making the gods' acquaintance. And of course, William James' context is he's pushing back against William Kingdon Clifford, who we can see as a precursor to the ontotheological metaphysics that come to be embraced by the Vienna Circle and logical positivism, where we know Heidegger does not embrace that, right? This is the pushback against the idea that truth is only that which is opposed to falsity. And for Heidegger, that's not incorrect, but it's woefully incomplete, because truth is aletheia, it is infinite, and it is ever unconcealing. And so I've always found it interesting that James wanted to push back against Clifford. Clifford, of course, had this quote, "It's wrong always for everyone everywhere to believe anything without sufficient evidence," right? And so what is that if not truth reduced to that which opposes falsity? So I do think James would agree with Heidegger that thinking begins only when we have come to know that reason, glorified for centuries, is the stiff-necked adversary of thought. The kind of thinking Heidegger is trying to prompt us to do, right, was captured very well in the presentation preceding this one. But, is this tarrying, whiling, circling back, wandering, meandering, questioning. Now, our paradigm in framing Gestell and its merely calculative thinking, it requires ontotheological metaphysics and vice versa. Perhaps formal logic would call it a biconditional. I'm not really sure. But these things are so tightly interwoven that I don't think you can really have one without the other. But what is most pressing and most relevant are the practical consequences. For ontotheological metaphysics is in a very real sense something of a lie, a scam, a con, a prison, really, of sorts. And in short, it is a delusion. Ontotheological metaphysics and the many fundamentalisms that it gives birth to are unmerciful and unforgiving authoritarian regimes and masters who will not rest until everyone is properly ordered in the regime. Such a delusion is a danger of the highest order. And Heidegger tells us that delusion always believes that it sees, and that it sees in the only possible manner, even while its belief, is what's robbing it of sight. Properly understanding ontotheological metaphysics, however, is to move beyond it into ontological pluralism, as Thomson has discussed in his work. Ontological pluralism is the recognition of being as inexhaustible source, as that which makes the various constellations of intelligibility possible across time as well as those that have yet to come. It's a joyful embrace, ontological pluralism, a joyful embrace of our limited, partial perspectives, openness to new and different ways and expressions of being, open embrace of the boundlessness of being. Bharatwaj and I have come to think of it in the following way. If ontological pluralism is the theory, then what we are calling devotional polytheism is the practice. Again, like we mentioned last year, the term doesn't, it's clearly got its own issues, but as we noted last year, the very notion of polytheism is a construct of monotheism. And so if you go back prior, there's no mono or poly. So poly is birthed by mono. And so, there's all these issues with it, but that's nonetheless the term we're working with. Properly understanding ontotheological metaphysics and thus moving beyond it into ontological pluralism and devotional polytheism frees us from our enframing, from our enslavement to all things mono, what Heidegger called the one track, the one-sided, the univocal. We are thus set free from monotony. We understand the pressing need and necessity to steadfastly reject any and all claims to a one or final truth, to reject any and all fundamentalisms. Ontological pluralism and devotional polytheism enable us to move beyond the stifling, stunting, and ubiquitous monomania that characterizes contemporary reality and fuels the many conflicts among the various abhorrent fundamentalisms that are operative in our world at present. The embrace of ontological pluralism likewise enables us to reclaim ground that was forfeit by ontotheological metaphysics and any and all fundamentalisms. Reclaiming ground or territory ensures that it doesn't fall into hostile hands. And when we see the abandonment of territory via a particular ontotheological metaphysics, that always leads to someone or something else occupying that territory. And this is just one of the many reasons that any kind of mono propped up by ontotheological metaphysics is itself a danger. For by its very essence and in its nature, it abandons everything else except whatever falls under that purview of the one concept, the one thing, the one idea that matters. And so, yeah, we can talk about, if we have time, what I mean here by reclaiming ground and territory. Just a quick example would be the way in which neoliberal politics and sort of that mindset, identity politics, etc., in a sense, you could argue, abandoned men, right? And what has happened is the right has swooped in and said, hey, men, you know what's wrong? You don't have the mythic anymore. That's missing from your lives, the mythic. And of course, they have, taken that territory. And now someone I even know personally, it's very heartbreaking, has moved over into this right-wing mentality because of that abandoned territory. And so hopefully that gives you a sense of what I had in mind there. Now, I don't want to go too far because we want to have adequate time for Bharatwaj to present, and then he and I were going to talk a little before we open it up to questions. So hopefully this is clear so far. Again, I needed to recap a little from last time. One thing I want to point out, this is from Iain's essay, and then I kind of built on that. But, these futile attempts to reach perfect union with universality, right? And the way in which those things are fantasies. They are fantasies birthed by inauthentic being toward death. Thomson calls them a thanatological impulse. These impulses, that hold that there's some objective point of view that we can all attain, right, which is false, are clearly dangerous. They're clearly errors. But something he had pointed out was that, that thanatological impulse is an impulse to be dead, essentially. It's to be dead and for everyone else to be dead as well, whether literally or figuratively. It's an impulse to be not da sein, to be neither here nor there, because of a childish longing for certainty, right? To get to this place of certainty, right? Which is really neither here nor there. It's actually not even an existent place. And these can have horrible and deadly consequences because everyone, again, is expected to fall in line, right? They're going to be properly ordered in the domain of the orderable. And the good followers of the one truth, right, may get some kind of special dispensation, but they're nonetheless spiritually dead beings who have sworn their allegiance to some kind of particular monomania. The slogan, though, often becomes comply or die. And that's a serious issue. The ontological pluralist, on the other hand, has recognized and rejected all monomania and all the fundamentalisms of ontotheological metaphysics. The devotional polytheist then can enact the understanding by always keeping in mind the excess of being and training their attention upon being present, open, and tuned to whatever man conceal in whatever manner. Heidegger's thinking gives us much to help free us from enframing and ontotheological metaphysics, to help us turn danger into promise, to pursue conscious dwelling in the fourfold, and open up to communion with the divine as they which point and give signs, as Heidegger says. All right. So the divine here we're not understanding is going to tell me what to inscribe on some stone, and those are rules for all of us to follow. It doesn't work like that at all. We can learn to dwell with the gods of the mountains or dwell with the gods of the valley, for these gods, Heidegger tells us, are not the same, although they do receive their respective distinct essence from being itself, according to Heidegger. We can each of us become or unfold in such a way that we can travel anywhere across the earth and still be at home in being. We can become, as Thomson has termed it, ontologically indigenous. While inframing forces everyone and everything to assume their place, devotional polytheism and ontological pluralism free us. The ordering evaporates, opposites that were antagonistic become complementarity, and we can practice our devotional polytheism in such a way that it's always a thinking work in progress. There is no telos. And just as the task of thinking itself never ends, boundaries are always open for renegotiation. We do well to ponder our own ability to discern the difference, as Heidegger says, between a matter of thought, a matter of that is unthought, and I would add a matter that's being merely avoided, right? The tolerance required by ontological pluralism is a tolerance that is tolerant of everything except intolerance, as Thomson has noted. And of course, what this looks like on a practical level is something Bharatwaj and I continue to work on. And at the end of our presentation last year, we were given some really great questions to prompt our thinking on this. And we may take up some of that in a bit. But I'll just end with this. If you're asking yourself, okay, well, what is the litmus test or a litmus test for what ontological pluralism will not tolerate, right? Because it's this incredible tolerance, ontological pluralism. How do we know when we can't? These are just a few questions that I find work well. Is it a view, an idea, or an action that is predicated upon ontotheological metaphysics? That's most straightforward. Is it some type of fundamentalism? Is it purporting to be a one or final truth? Is it something that operates from a logic of domination? Is it something that sets forth some kind of hierarchy or system understood as inviolable or unchanging? And so those are just some thoughts so far. We may be working this for years, who knows? But at this point, I'll turn it over. Bharatwaj has some great stuff to share, and I appreciate you guys.
Thank you so much, Susanne, for that very, very rich presentation, which we will return to after a short presentation from me, and then we can discuss some questions that we are still trying to resolve, and then maybe we'll go to the Q&A. So is my screen visible? Is it?
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to discuss or continue the discussion about ontological pluralism and devotional polytheism from the point of view of the mystical tradition, and especially zoning in on the notion of tarrying. And I think Heidegger has some wonderful things to say about tarrying and how all that connects together. So I begin. So this is the introduction, section 1. Susanne and I have been dialoguing on the question of ontological pluralism and devotional polytheism as important philosophical notions that help us chart Heidegger's thinking. In true Socratic spirit, it continues to be a nourishing dialogue in friendship and searching. In our engagement with this question, we hold that if ontological pluralism relates to the understanding side of being, or the side of understanding being, then devotional polytheism relates to the comportment with being and its abundance of possibilities. Iain Thomson defines ontological pluralism as follows, and I quote, Heidegger's ontological pluralism thus suggests that the meaning of being itself is intrinsically multiple, and that this multiplicity of genuine meanings can never be reduced to a single all-encompassing understanding. Such an understanding of the intrinsic plurality of being requires of us a careful tenderness in our comportment towards beings, which primarily means understanding how no system or all-encompassing regime of truth can give us a total understanding precluding otherwise meanings. The careful tending of beings involves humble awareness of the otherwise possibilities of understanding that constitute all beings, all things or all beings. Furthermore, this understanding of the inexhaustibility of beings or the inexhaustibility of our understanding of being and our comportment with beings, is deeply connected to the engaged, ethical, socio-political dimension of ontological pluralism that we have defined as devotional polytheism. By the end of our presentation and discussion and dialogue, we shall have arrived at something of a definition to this polyvalent notion of devotional polytheism. For now, here's an important quote from Iain Thomson, where he says, Heidegger's phenomenological redescription of the gods can still be tentatively characterized as polytheistic. Thomson is justly restrained in this characterization for fear of the reduction of the encounter with being in terms of isms, like monotheism, agnosticism, atheism, and so on. We think, however, that the adjective of polytheistic may still be tentatively possible in the sense Thomson has in mind when understood in its connection with ontotheology and ontological pluralism. Take note of the following. In the 1957 lecture course entitled The Ontotheological Constitution of Metaphysics, Heidegger presents us with the definition of ontotheology as a double grounding of both the ultimate stuff of reality that constitutes ontology and the paradigmatic instance in reference to which the whole can be understood. That gives us the dimension of theology, giving us at once a basic and total explanation. This topic is itself too long and cannot be covered in detail here. But there is an interesting and often ignored question that leads him to his definition of ontotheology. And that question is, how does the deity or how does God enter into philosophy? The term deity here is not used in the common sense of a personal creator God, but rather as the function of grounding and accounting of the totality of entities. This is the deeper meaning of theon that Heidegger reads in Aristotle. However, if the position of ontological pluralism recognizes that the foundation or ground of the constellations of intelligibility is nothing transcendent or permanent, but rather moves across the epochal history of being, then this position is also the recognition of the polythei across historical grounding. Furthermore, the gods or divinities understood beyond metaphysical monomania allow things to shine forth rather than grounding them on unshakable foundations. They allow fragile finitude rather than merely transcendent permanence. Thus, we move from ontological pluralism to its flip side of ontological polytheism. However, such a recognition of different and otherwise grounding of being and intelligibility makes a demand of us, an ethical and even political demand of sensitivity and deep recognition of other cultures, traditions, and other sources or grounds of value and meaning. It requires of us a tarrying ethic. This tender, non-judgmental, devoting to possibilities beyond the boundaries of one's own takes us from ontological pluralism to ontological polytheism to devotional polytheism, which involves this ethic of tender openness to mystery and to the other. Taking the discussion into a further angle, the following short presentation will discuss ontological pluralism and devotional polytheism through the lens of mysticism, developing Heidegger's understanding of the mystical comportment towards being. In doing so, I pick up the discussion from Susanne's emphasis on decision, but approach it from its lenticular flip side, tarrying or lingering. Susanne and I understand this tarrying as involving the stepping back from rushing forth to capture entities according to the pre-established and prepared metaphysical models that already go ahead and determine what qualifies as an object within a particular configuration of intelligibility. In his 1935-36 lecture course, What is a Thing?, Heidegger defines this objective representation in terms of the Entwurf, or the project or even blueprint, by describing it as, I quote, a project of thinghood which, as it were, skips over things. The project first opens a domain where things or facts show themselves. End quote. The metaphysical blueprint for an epoch always already decides in advance the domain, the playing space that contours or delimits the showing of things. As Heidegger states in his 1938 lecture, The Age of the World Picture, metaphysics provides that age with the ground of its essential shape. There is a simple way to understand this playing field. Imagine, if possible, a village in 15th century Tibet. In this world, metaphysically structured according to the principles or Entwurf of Mahayana Buddhism, a being like a Dakini, a goddess in the Tibetan tradition, counts as a real entity in a way that she does not make the cut in the late modern age of Western metaphysics, where the human subject, and I quote from the lecture, the 1938 lecture, The World as the Age of the World Picture, where the human subject, quote, becomes the being upon which every being, in its way of being and its truth, is founded. Man becomes the referential center of beings as such. Thus, it is the calculating and measuring human subject who already sets the limits to what can count as real. To tarry is to step back from the headlong dive from the magnetic pull of objectification. The breaking up of this headlong dive, understood in its deepest ontohistorical sense, first scissions things from their status as objects framed according to a certain metaphysical blueprint. Lingering or tarrying as a comportment of Dasein towards entities must be understood in this sense, as allowing things to shine in their own light, unobscured by blind metaphysical objectification. One must be careful here, however. All this does not mean that Dasein can simply will itself out of the metaphysical structure it historically inhabits. However, it can step back and recognize the metaphysically established structure of intelligibility for what it is, as non-eternal but rather historical and contingent upon the plate tectonics of the history of being. This is actually a Iain Thomson phrase. It is this recognition that is involved in mystical tarrying, as we shall see with Silesius. We argue that the mystic and the poet are figures in Heidegger's thinking that teach us this tarrying that waits upon things, allowing their abundance of possibilities to shine beyond the monolithic fixity of metaphysical ontotheology. As Susan has stated to me multiple times, that the mystic and the poet are hyper-aware of finitude. Their awareness of finitude in all its historical depth makes them capable of understanding the infinitude of other ways and otherwise constellations of intelligibility. Heidegger's discussion of Silesius and his notion of without why from the 55-56 lecture course, The Principle of Reason, is an important text for the development of the notion of tarrying in its relationship with the question of ontotheological foundationalism and the mystic's recognition of otherwise worlds beyond the boundaries of her own. For now, before we begin the next section on tarrying, take a listen to these words from Thich Nhat Hanh, found in chapter 6 of his 1998 text, The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching. He says, Buddhist meditation has two aspects, shamatha and vipassana. We tend to stress the importance of vipassana, looking deeply, because it can bring us insight and liberate us from suffering and afflictions. But the practice of shamatha, stopping, is fundamental. And he states finally that if we cannot stop, we cannot have insight. As we move forward, this notion of shamatha as the practice of stopping, of breaking our sprint, of stepping back will be significant. It is significantly connected to the other side of the coin, vipassana, or insight into things that decouples or decisions them from their pre-given, pre-contoured set of meanings according to the metaphysical blueprint. However, here the two aspects of stopping and looking deeply are understood not only in the psychological sense of how the mind is trapped in its conceptual motion machine, needing a break so that it can look at things afresh. Rather, it is understood also in its deepest ontohistorical sense. The stopping of shamatha is not just related to the mind and its psychological functioning, but is related to the being in the world that is Dasein itself. Second section, tarrying and grounding. Before we engage with the mystical notion of tarrying from the 55-56 lecture course, let us quickly understand what violent means in general for Heidegger. In entry number 125 of the Cambridge Heidegger Lexicon, Richard Capobianco defines violent, tarrying or lingering as a moving rest or stillness, which is Heidegger's way of regarding the essence of entities in processual terms, beyond the timeless and metaphysically stable sense understood in the history of philosophy. The understanding of entities as whiling for a while is, according to Capobianco, Heidegger's solution to the long-standing historical debate between the primacy of being and or becoming. Further, in his 1946 text, Anaximander's Saying, we have a succinct definition from Heidegger on the whiling of entities. And I quote, "The things which stay a while come to presence from out of the jointure between approach and withdrawal. They presence in the between of a twofold absence. They presence in each time of their while." End quote. This betweenness that stands in the jointure of approach and withdrawal is how Heidegger describes beings. Things then are this between. They linger for a while. Returning to Capobianco's words, the age-old metaphysical distinction between becoming and being was grounded by Heidegger in the one-fold of the being way, or being process itself, unfold. However, it is important here to understand that by the temporal sway of entities, Heidegger is stating something more than process metaphysics or the doctrine of momentariness called Kshanikavad in the school of Sautantrika Buddhism. No doubt, these philosophical positions are important challenges to any merely substance or subject metaphysics, but still Heidegger's unique move needs to be understood in his own terms. This unique notion of whiling is developed fully and in relation to his central project of querying the meaning of being in the 55-56 lecture course, The Principle of Reason. The figure of the mystic, or the figure of Heidegger's mystic, appears prominently in the person of Johannes Scheffler or Angelus Silesius in Heidegger's 55-56 lecture course, The Principle of Reason. For Heidegger, mystics like Meister Eckhart or Silesius represent what he calls in his 1927 text, Basic Problems of Phenomenology, as mysticism, as representing mysticism understood in the eminent sense as opposed to the bad sense. Heidegger explains in the same place that the great tradition of speculative mysticism among the mystics like Eckhart attempts to disrupt and creatively overcome the metaphysical conception of essence and existence. In other words, the tradition of speculative mysticism in its eminent form creatively engages, but in a different way, with the question of grounding that metaphysics is engaged in. It is precisely on the question of ground that Heidegger brings Silesius in dialogue with Leibniz and his principle of reason. According to Heidegger, when it comes to the matter of ground, the most extreme sharpness and depth of thought belongs to the genuine and great mystics. This gives us an important thumb rule, I believe, for taking Heidegger's thinking to mystical traditions beyond the West, which he himself might not have been aware of, like, for instance, Sufi mysticism and the eminent thinker poets in those traditions like Rumi or Ibn al-Arabi. Heidegger engages with two lines from Silesius's Cherubinic Wanderer. The lines read thus: "The rose is without why, it blooms because it blooms." In the German, it goes, and forgive my terrible pronunciation, "Die Rose ist ohne Warum, sie bluet while sie bluet. Though such a statement keeps the rose outside the orbit and pull of Leibniz's principle of reason, Heidegger notes something curious about this statement. He notes that though for Silesius the rose does not have a why or warum, it still has a because or while. These lines and their apparently contradictory juxtaposition indicate that Silesius is suggesting something much deeper than sheer groundless abyss. Rather, the bringing together of the ohne warum and while points to an otherwise way of understanding grounding. This is simply borne out by Heidegger when he states the because in that statement names a ground, but an odd and presumably distinguished ground. This distinguished ground is a groundless ground, but not like the deity of theism, which grounds all things but is itself ungrounded by a deeper ground. Rather, and he says, the because names the supportive presence before which we simply pause or before which we tarry. As we pause and hear carefully, the because points to the essence of grounds. The because also points to the essence of being. Unquote. In fact, Heidegger states that the while or because in this line relates to the whilen or whiling or tarrying or lingering that points to a more ancient meaning of being. To quote him, whiling, tarrying, perpetuating is indeed the old sense of the word being. The while that every founding and every why guards against, the while that every founding and every why, and I'm thinking here, the while that every ontotheological metaphysical type of grounding guards against, names the simple, plain presence that is without why, the presence upon which everything depends, upon which everything rests. Unquote. However, the mystery is not yet solved, because the without why is still a support upon which everything depends. For there is something still ground-like about the support. What sort of support to entities is the because which points towards being and which is obscured by the clamor of the metaphysical why? As I will show, such a ground as support is a whiling ground, a moving, shifting, finite, temporal ground, unlike the permanent, transcendent foundationalism of metaphysics represented here by the Leibnizian why. Such a whiling ground is being, proffering itself as ground for a while, and simultaneously withdrawing all the other possible ways of grounding that adumbrate across time. In explaining this adumbration across time, Heidegger states, as he repeats several times in this lecture course, quote, being comes to be experienced as ground. However, in the clamor of the why that obscures the because, being is totally reduced to ground, or being is totally reduced to the account without remainder, forgetting its inexhaustibility. If read carefully, this is precisely the totalizing capture of metaphysical ontotheology. Heidegger shows in the last passages from the last lecture how this adumbration across time works. He states, this holds in the various transformations and indeed unequivocally throughout the entire history of Western thought. The history of Western thought, and I think all histories of metaphysics across the globe, including histories of metaphysics in India, in Thailand, and so on and so forth, is but the history of the polythei of successively proffered withheld foundations. The tarrying of the mystics, on the other hand, unlike the metaphysician, attends to the because and is, and I quote, and is awake enough for the stillness of the appeal in the word of being to prevail over the clamor of the claim of the principium. It would be presumptuous to simply say that the mystic has overcome the metaphysical clamor. We can only say that she has recognized the clamor for what it is. This means that through her stepping back, the mystic is able to see how the ground, which metaphysics equates with being, is but being which gives us ground. The metaphysical ground then is not some infinite, unquestionable foundation untouched by history and time. Rather, it is one particular bracketed, parenthesized, epochal manner of the giving, showing of being, which necessarily also keeps in reserve its abundant otherwiseability. This awareness of finitude is what the great and eminent mystics offer. And only such an awareness of finitude, Heidegger finally states, is capable of dying. That means to take on death as death. Susanne and I have spent some long hours discussing how this discussion of mortality and the entire question of finitude and the mystical engagement with finitude can be situated in Thomson's work on existential death as opposed to biological demise, understood not only in terms of individual world collapse, but in terms of the fragile collapsibility of all worlding, or what Susanne so interestingly discussed in terms of vulnerability. The pluralist tarrying ethic that this ontology demands is based not only on the recognition of the other and the otherwise beyond the fragile boundary of our own, but also the marginalized and oppressed at the edge and boundary, at our own edge and boundary, that through their resistive comportment towards the center already bring into sharp relief the contoured and delimited nature of all grounding regimes. The further implications of our tarrying ethic will be discussed in a short dialogue between Susanne and I before we open up the floor for questions. So that was my sort of short presentation on tarrying and the place of mysticism and how the mystic engages with grounding from within, immanently from within Heidegger's own text. So thank you so much for listening. With that, I think I should begin maybe with a question to Susanne so that we could then. But I just wanted to know, Alfred, how are we doing with time? Because I can see that there's only 10 minutes in the allotted time left. So if we do a long.
I think there's 40. I think there's 40 minutes left. Is that right,
Okay.
Alfred? Yeah.
All right. All right. So then maybe we could begin the conversation with perhaps one of the things, Susanne, you and I have been discussing, which is this idea of tarrying. And sorry to begin with tarrying because it's in my head right now because of the whole discussion about tarrying in Heidegger. But we have been discussing about what that tarrying means in our situatedness in an urban global world, in cities, in all the traffic of technological instruments and so on. So how do you think we can think about tarrying, not only in the sense of being in the provinces, but being in the center of the city, in the marketplace, and so on and so forth? So maybe I thought that could be a good pointer
Sure.
to begin with.
Sure. And it's I think it's interestingly related to the previous two presentations that we heard prior to ours. So I think when we were talking about it before, and this ties to something Leighton was saying in the end too about how, as Alfred asked the question about painting the boundary between the urban and the forest. I mean, in one sense, it's the tarrying clearly is easier, if you will, in the forest, in nature. But even there, I think we probably, each of us maybe have witnessed people who, jogging down a path with their earbuds in, right? That there's no tarrying happening. But in the urban places, one thing that comes to mind for me is I actually think of some beautiful European cities where they appear to have, there's been some thought put into the design such that there is an aim to promote tarrying. I'm thinking of, beautiful plazas with a lot of seating. gorgeous architecture, things that would provide the opportunity to tarry a while, right, and to sort of be open and absorb and perceive. But when it comes down to it, I think that once we have a grasp for the concepts, all of these many concepts that in a lot of words, but in some ways I sometimes feel like they're really all saying one thing.
Yeah.
We can tarry in the market. Again, what does that mean exactly? I don't know. I'm not claiming that we can have one definition, but spending time, I think in moments where I realize I'm really drawn into the way the water droplets on the produce look, and something as simple as that. But yeah, and then the previous presentation prior to Leighton, she was talking about specifically China and just the existential malaise and these people who don't have time to even engage in the luxury of boredom, right? The gestell, if you will, the framing is such that people don't even have time for that, and that, then they try to assuage their suffering through endless scrolling, right, and indulgence in media. But I do believe that we can tarry anywhere that we may be. While some places are more conducive, I think the opportunity is there. We can make a decision to tarry. I can tarry while chatting with a neighbor, right? A lot of times, unfortunately, I think people when we interact with others, it's like, how can I wrap this up quickly, right? And there's a lot of small talk and just back and forth with meaninglessness. But what is it to take a couple of moments and tarry with that neighbor? Tarry on my front deck, tarry while I interact with my cat. So yeah, I think it's possible anywhere, and it's just a matter of giving some thought to it. Certainly tarrying with a passage in a book. I think we all do a lot of that. I imagine reading some Heidegger and just there with that one paragraph. So yeah, and I'm not sure if that's exactly what you had in mind, but I think it's anytime, any place under the right impetus.
I sometimes also feel that the urban might actually give more of, I mean, in our sort of technologically crowded lives, it in a way gives the game away. It shows itself so blatantly, and it indicates the need for tarrying so much more, that maybe in the urban sort of technological I mean, it's the danger of becoming the promise kind of dynamic. So I sometimes feel that the urban might actually also be an inviting space for engaging in tarrying, and also maybe point to the whole problem about how one is not tarrying. So I was wondering about that, even when in the previous presentation about smartphone use and so on. I mean, it's so. I mean, it's so blatant, and it captures so much of our existence that, in a way, it shows itself for what it is, and that itself could become an opportunity. So yeah. So, and there are also interesting places in the city, which, like you were saying, which are sort of are designed to tarry, like a library, for example, which sort of has that invitational aspect to it. Yeah, very interesting. Um, should we also discuss the questions that were asked last time? You did actually um, address them at the end of your lecture, but if you wish to expand on that more, we were asked at the end of the last presentation about how far would this pluralism go? What can it? Will it tolerate everything?
Right.
And if it will not tolerate everything, then to what extent is it consistently pluralistic?
Right.
And so maybe we could expand
Sure.
on that. Maybe. Yeah.
Right. And so that's why at the end of my little
Yeah.
part, I said we're trying to formulate a kind of litmus test.
Yeah.
And it's that again. That's why it's important to stress that the boundaries are always open for renegotiation. Um, and I think in some ways I've recently been thinking about these ideas as really,
Mm-hmm.
in a certain sense, aligning well with Aristotelian virtue ethics, because as far as
Okay.
ethics go, right, you've got your Kant and your utilitarianism, which are very like formulaic. They both have beautiful things to offer, no doubt. But I've always, found Aristotle's to just be so much more nuanced, and everything is context based, situational based. You have to understand the character of the person, and so I think that is how the ontological pluralism would function. I mean, if we're talking about its functioning,
Yeah.
there's no, we're not going to be able to come up with this set of rules and a doctrine or creed and write them out and say, well, here it is, now everybody follow it. It simply cannot function like that, because that would be another kind of ontological metaphysics.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes. So,
So
so
I
it
think,
has to be sensitive to context, you're saying, and sensitive to
right, and the
situation
character
and so on.
situation, the character of the person. I mean, what are we dealing with? We're talking about an idea, an action, a behavior, a belief, a movement, a politics. There's all these things, and that's why I just put forth this. What was it, 4 or 5 questions that can
Yeah.
operate as part of that litmus test? But we could formulate further questions.
We also, I think we also, when we were discussing about this question, we also came up with this formulation. And so it is a formulation though, but it's not as bad as, all these other formulations that could be like unbending and so on. So one formulation that I remember us discussing was, so the door of this pluralism is open so far as the ideology or the idea being invited does not negate that very principle, and so something that is by definition anti-plural. So
Right,
we then connected that to Kant's notion of the practical contradiction, that
right,
you cannot lie because if you, or you cannot break an oath, because if you break an oath, and if that were to become the universal norm, then the very principle of oath taking will become negated. So similarly, if ontological pluralism were to invite that which is intrinsically anti-plural, the very it will contradict itself, kind of.
right,
So that was also, I think that was also interesting
right.
way
And
that
I think
we.
that's a good point, and I think that one works. The contradictory idea, that's a principle that we could say, we can keep, and that works practically, putting
Mhm.
it to use. But yeah, I mean, it's a ontological pluralism as such, and as you pointed out, we have to think plurally about pluralism. It's inherently promoting
Yeah.
thinking and reflection and examination. And I was thinking about Leighton's presentation. I think he called himself, I can't remember now if it was ecological or environmental artist.
Yeah.
Just, 'cause environmentalism is an important thing that I know we've talked about and I've written about and concerned about. But, the way in which we approach nature, right?
Mm.
There's definitely ways that are unfolding in our world that, are predicated on a non-theological metaphysics, and those approaches to nature are destructive and really should be stopped in whatever manner, from continuing before
Yeah.
basically we have an uninhabitable earth for humans anyway.
Right.
But yeah, and then one other thing before we open it up would just be, you referenced how we had been talking about the death, just the concept of death versus demise, and the so world collapse. If you recall, we had discussed that recently, and I mentioned when I was talking about encounter with divinities in the fourfold could, world shatter, or, it could be more subtle. And this idea of death as world collapse, I think, is a great way to make sense out of how Heidegger discusses death, and he does not mean demise, right? He clearly, because he says we can learn to practice, mortals can learn to practice death so that they can have the good death. But again, being plural, world collapse is great, but I think we need to be at least willing to recognize that there's other ways that worlds come into being. It doesn't have to be world collapse and then the new world emerge. There could be a more slow and organic.
Because is it just to interrupt you? Is it because that is implicitly sort of violent? Do you think that there's at least a tone of violence to to a
right? Well, it's not just the violence. It's not just the violence. World collapse to me entails of quickness. There's a time thing there. I think that there's this.
Oh yeah,
pretty fast. Whereas I think a new world can be birthed over a long period of time, and I think that often does happen. And so when we're talking about death, Heideggerian death, I think we have to make sure we understand that, and we're not talking about demise, we're talking about this other notion of death, that it can be a long and protracted process. Say whatever, I'm a committed atheist, and over the course of many years of painting in the forest, I become more spiritual, right? That'd be a long death, but ultimately the world that exists at T2 is very different than the world that exists.
So there's a sort of a gradient to the shift of the world. Like it's not like it's not like happening like this, but it's happening across.
Right. Right. And so just in terms of the death and how the death unfolds, world collapse, absolutely. But I think the worlds can change in other ways.
You came up with an interesting term for this. I don't remember now. You said something like world germination. No, world germination, something like that. You were thinking about another term for this. I think it's in my notes. I have to go and check. But it was an interesting. If I could just, and if before we go, just a quick. I thought Akim's question about how we don't speak about the gods is also interesting, because there is this sort of tendency to couch it in a Western. Like, I'm not Western, but I do that too. Maybe because everything is Western basically now. But I think we can we can discuss that maybe in the Q&A or something. But that I thought that's an interesting thing. We still don't quite speak in that language, and I don't know why we don't. But
maybe that's where we should just drop the term gods, goddesses, divinities, and just use the sacred. That. Maybe that would be better.
Because the gods and goddesses are more entity-like, reified.
Yeah, they carry all these connotations. But yeah, so maybe that's where we could let anybody that has a question or comment. Thank you, guys.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
So, who wants to go first? Joachim?
I'd like to comment on your presentation. I think it was excellent, just the way you presented your ideas to us, basically at first individually, but in correspondence and conversation with each other, and then coming together in a conversation to which we are now invited. So thank you very much. It was excellent. So, I mean, very rich in many ways. I first would hesitate to give up the words gods and goddesses and replace it with maybe the divine or the sacred, back to my initial question I had. So how do we best translate the Göttlichen of the Fourfold? So divine, I would take that as a formal indication to what is there. And so is there not a better word in English? Because gods and goddesses, Heidegger could have used. He didn't say die Götter und Göttinnen. He said, oder Gottheiten. He didn't say that. He said die Göttlichen. So who are they? Are these humans who have become divine? Something like that, intermediaries. So are these the preparatory human beings that are in the transition of overcoming metaphysics? Are these advanced humans? Maybe that, or are the poets and thinkers already the ones who recognize the divine or the Die Göttlichen and are in communication with them? So are these angels in the ancient word picture? So that is what my response to your conversation. So a question to how do you pronounce your first name?
Bharatwaj.
Bharatwaj. So since when you talked about finitude, you also introduced us to the word infinitude, but didn't really explore that. And the prefix was emphasized. There is one question, maybe whether you clarified it, and then a comment. Since that was really a great insight, that the word "weil" basically is connected with violin, that Heidegger recognizes, and then we have it in English "whiling." But and then maybe that is something that you want to also add to your to your paper. We have in German the word "Weiler," and Weiler is just a little settlement where people have come together to live together in a social gathering that makes survival possible, and that is directly connected with what Plato says in the Republic when he contemplates the meaning of the word the polis. Polis, so basically, is also a place where humans gather to make life possible in a human way, whatever that human way means. But and then say it again. And then say it again. So just let me finish the thought. Since he connects polis with the Greek word verb, pelein, another word for to be. Okay, so that's the being that you have in mind when you talk about violin. And then you may want to also connect that with Heidegger's concept of Jeweiligkeit that he brings in to being in time, and make something of that there too. So thanks. Right. It was really good. And so and my last thing is, so how can one, and I say one as das Mann, how can one tarry in a busy world where money, economy, productivity, that I call modernity, basically rules? How can one carry in such a world, tarry in such a world? And I think that is the imperative, that we shall do that. I think according to Heidegger, but you may read Heidegger differently than I.
Heidegger doesn't use Jeweiligkeit in being in time. He uses it before and then replaces it as Jeweiligkeit.
Jeweiligkeit, yeah. Thank you for that clarification. Exactly. I had that in mind and I could not point that out, but that's right. He uses Jeweiligkeit instead of Jeweiligkeit, replaces that then in being in time. But still, it's there. Yeah. The je is there and gets the je, the specific, also the in each caseness. Yeah. What I would translate the in each caseness, the je, is in being in time and gets constantly overlooked. For example, with the translation of with the English minus doesn't translate Jeweiligkeit. No, Jeweiligkeit, that's the word. The je is not translated in the minus, and that is a problem.
Right. About the tarrying in a world where we are basically constantly propelled to exert beyond our means, to be overproductive, and so on. One sort of way that I've been thinking about that, like it's also like, for instance, about the tarrying in an urban, technologically trafficked, technologically busy existence. One way that I think about that is how it could, in fact, invite us to it can yank us from its from our being dissolved in that mode of being, because of how insistent it is. Because it's so insistent and because it's so all pervading, it somehow is capable of yanking us out of it. That's kind of how I read the greatest danger being also the greatest promise, in that it is so all pervading that it kind of gives the show away. It doesn't know absence. It doesn't know that play of absence and presence in some sense. It's so blinding that it gives itself up in that sense, and that could be a sort of invitation to look at it squarely. This is what I sort of feel when I think about that question, either about money or about productivity or about the earlier presentation on attention deficit and so on. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I've been thinking about that.
I think it also depends on city. City is a bit of a general concept. There's a big difference between a city like Florence and Tokyo, where you have 40 million people living. And a lot of European cities have these small parks and spaces where there are also public benches.
Right.
In Germany, they also like to put them in nature, so you can sit at a certain point and enjoy the view, and while there, tarry there. So there is different ways of looking at it. I think the people who tarry in the big cities are the homeless. That's why they irritate, because they make us realize that we're just running around like idiots.
Right. Right. I think that's an excellent point, Alfred, about the way in which the presence of homeless, make us aware. And to go back to Joachim's question, one thing that jumped to mind was the essay on poverty, From the first time I read it, like the way I took it was sort of he's valorizing simplicity, and I feel like translating as poverty can turn people away from the ideas, because we've demonized poverty to such an extent in America, anyway, that people not only dislike homeless, they actively try to harm them. So, I mean, there's various things happening in different cities where they're trying to round them up and they want to put them in prison.
Yeah.
So I think simplicity is a thing that we can examine. And, people who go through grad school and things like that may already have a little bit of experience with living more simply. And then it became trendy, I think, right? Well, I can't remember her name, but she's some lady that can help you get rid of your stuff. But I think there are ways in which we, at least if we have some modicum of freedom, there are many ways we can push back against that. And like Bharatwaj says, when it's in our face, we can become very acutely aware of it. And hopefully we can also realize that we need to push back. And so, this whole thing, for example, this iPhone thing, I didn't even get one until 2012. And then I couldn't believe the way they were constantly trying to make me buy a new one. And I'm only on my third iPhone ever, because I will keep that until it does not work. And, that's just one way in which I feel kind of like, no, I'm not going to do what you tell me. And, I think we can apply that to a lot of things. Go ahead.
No, there's this interesting sort of Lacanian. I mean, she's a wonderful introductory writer on Lacan. So, like, I struggle a lot to understand what Lacan is saying. Her name is Mari Ruti, and in one of her books she talks about how she holds on to her laptop, which is like an old laptop, and she feels a sort of commitment to still. And she has a sort of commitment and relationship with her old laptop, and she wouldn't give it up no matter what. And it's sort of, I don't know. I was reminded of her when you said about the iPhone but she also makes the point about how there's this culture of constant newness, newness being the standard of success or excellence, and
That's
so on.
called fashion.
Sorry, Alfred?
That's called fashion. You need to change your clothes every year. You need to change the interior of your house every year
Right.
to be in
Yeah.
It's
fashion.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's
I'm also
it's
still without an iPhone.
right. But yeah, so I think there are, I mean, obviously, if I'm thinking of like academics who are, full-time tenured, and there's these requirements, right? How many committees do you need to be on, right, before you're allowed to maintain your position? I mean, there is obviously things that can restrict us as to where we can push back or in what way. But, I think we can find those ways, and we can insist on the tarrying. We can insist on having time each day where we do nothing, right? And it can become a practice. I mean, it's, I don't know. It takes effort and awareness, right? But, yeah.
It's an interesting formulation, doing nothing.
Doing nothing.
Yeah. Well, and and in that nothing, I mean, personally for me, it is a practice, and that's sometimes where something just comes out of nowhere, it seems, and it's an insight or whatever, and it can be very valuable, meaningful, powerful.
So you could also be spending time with your cats, and
right.
But we need to go to Iain, who has been patiently waiting for his chance.
He's wiling up there.
Well, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Let me echo Occam's remarks about that. That was great, and I'm honored that you are inspired by some of the things I said and are taking them much further. So, just a couple thoughts. The reason as the most thick-necked adversary of thought, that strikes me as phylogocentric Satanism. The thick-necked is the phylogocentric part, and the adversary, Has-Satan. So anyway, do with that what you will. The comply or die thing, too, in the light of contemporary American and especially politics, copulation, the copula, the analytic reduction of being to the copula, the A equals A stuff. So copulation as like comply or die. How dare you resist our orders? And the sense of like authority without an author, that's Das Man. So like people who you have to obey me, even though what I'm saying is not owned by any ethical source or agent. Like I'm. Why do you have to do what I'm telling you to do? Because I'm telling you to do it, even if it's wrong, right? Like comply with my militarism, comply with my hierarchical orders. It's really, I thought that was all very nice. Bharatwaj, the thought about what'd you call it? I wrote it down. Otherwise ability. So good. So, but I feel like you're trying to split the difference between difference and alterity or otherness. And it's interesting, and maybe you can. Maybe that's you've sublated the dichotomy in some interesting way. But for me, it gets to the phenomenal. I always need examples, to think about this stuff. And I don't want to be like a Hegelian, just deducing it from abstract principles or something. So when I think about tarrying, verweilen, it's this in Was heißt denken, in a passage that didn't get translated into the English. Heidegger explains Anwesen with a hyphen, presencing is the standard translation now, as opposed to Anwesenheit, presence. And Anwesen he defines as entering into and emerging from lasting tarrying. Mm-hmm. And so that stuff about the connection to a more ancient word for being, I take it that's phusis, because phusis is something like this coming from nothing, coming into being, peaking, going, passing away, and returning to nothing. So there's this dynamic notion to it. So when I think about how to explain tarrying to undergrads and stuff, there's something tricky about it. And moving rest could work. I mean, there's like a Hemingway sense to like the movable feast or something that I like in that. But when I think of like what it's like to stand in front of the Van Gogh painting of the shoes that Heidegger loves, I think it's very tempting to think that that thing's like a still life. Like it's not doing anything. It's just like a painting. It's frozen. It's not moving. It's at rest. And I think that's false. Like I think that's like how you see it when you walk by it without looking at it, when you don't give yourself time to just open yourself to it. And when you open yourself to it, you're more, I think, like Odysseus tied to the mast and hearing the call of this. It's like a kind of bound movement. You see that something's been captured and there's a central image that is obvious to all, but that when you tune into it, you know, there's all these other suggestive possibilities kind of leaping off the canvas and the ink. So for me, the what are we open to? It's like, are we still, and what we're open to is movement, you know, so that once we still ourselves, we're able to recognize that this thing we like to call reality, as if it was a substance, a race, is in fact a kind of inexhaustible, overflowing excessiveness that has this dynamism that, you know, the whole metaphysics of presence missed, that the thought that only what is permanently enduring is real missed, you know. And how do we combat that? And last thought, there was a great little Sarah Silverman clip that I came across the other day that I think makes the Heideggerian point, because it's very easy to go from the metaphysics of presence to the Nietzschean metaphysics of dynamic becoming. But that's our nihilistic age, where constant transformation is how we understand being. So we have to figure out a way to recognize meaningful enduring within a background of coming into and passing out of being. So she tells this funny story. It's kind of dark, but she's like, I just got this little puppy. It's so cute. I love it so much. But it's going to die, and my heart can't take it. So I'm going to put it to sleep tomorrow. Everybody laughs. And then she says, you know, if you think about it, you know, from the perspective of the universe, what's living for one day versus living for, you know, 12, 14 years? It's the same. It doesn't matter. So I'm right. So if you adopt that kind of view that, you know, everything's just flux and transformation and nothing permanent will live forever, so nothing matters, then it doesn't matter if your dog lives one day or 12 years.
Right. I was struck by so I was reading Primo Levi in his Auschwitz diaries, and there's a scene there where he's trying to break an icicle outside the window, and because he's thirsty, he hasn't had water for days, and so the only source of water is that icicle. He's trying to break it, but a guard comes and hits him on the hand, and he asks the guard, Varum, and the guard says, "Here is kein Varum. There is no why here." And it immediately, I thought, okay, but so whys are sometimes necessary. It's not, we don't have the, like you said, we don't jump directly to no foundations at all, which is why I like when Heidegger says, even though it is without why, there is a because. And in my reading, it looks as if Heidegger is saying that this because tarries, the ground tarries for a while, and another epoch comes, and there's a shift. But it's not as if we have complete meaninglessness. So you, in your, like the 2005 book, you distinguish between Abgrund, Urgrund, and the middle position is the Ungrund. So it's not like permanent foundation, nor is it nihilism, but a kind of moving foundation or a moving ground. So I thought that it just reminded me of this. That
nice. The image I use in the postmodernism book is Magritte's painting of the castle over the Pyrenees, which is like a floating island, and that's us. So we're a groundless ground, And
Yeah.
you know, you talked about the relation between individual death and like historical death, and there's a groundless ground in being in time, Dasein, and then a groundless ground of these historical ages in later Heidegger. But when epochs change, when we go from being, you know, medieval to modern with Descartes, say, is it that we are just tuning into something in the groundless ground, or is that groundless ground somehow getting beyond itself to the source that made it possible and impossible, to add the Derridian twist? I take it the latter, you know, that there's something, the nothing, earth being as such, that overflows whatever possible sense we can make of it. And that's what metaphysics, as you guys were so nicely saying, you know, is in denial of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. There's also a risk there, right? It could go the other way. I mean, like Susanne was saying about vulnerability, that's also a vulnerable point. One could go the former direction as well, rather than the latter.
Say it again. Sorry, I didn't follow that.
I mean, there's also that vulnerability that one could take it in the former sense rather than the latter sense of a source looking. I mean, it's like the nothing, which could be understood in both ways. One could risk looking at the nothing as a sort of a let's say, annihilating nothing would be active nothing. So whatever is the opposite of the act of nothing, there's that risk that one goes there rather than the other way. So
nice. And you could maybe flesh out that difference in terms of your concentration camp guard versus Angelus Silenius, you know, like those are very different without Wise.
Indeed, yes.
That's a good ending to the evening for me. It's been a long day since 11:30.
Not bad.
So thank again to you both for the wonderful presentations. Thanks for everybody who's still here and has joined in for this presentation. And